thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me here.
I know since we last spoke, and I'm sure people will figure this out as you're discussing your work, you have what appears to be the dream job. I'm sure it's both exciting and also lots of work, but the description that you gave me was pretty interesting. So I'm excited to have folks have a chance to meet you and learn a little bit more about your work. So for those who are joining for the first time and who haven't had a chance to speak or meet with Sarah, Sarah's the VP AI and machine learning research at Fidelity Investments. At Fidelity, it's AI and machine learning trends that will impact Fidelity in the next 3 to 5 years. So she was nominated as a Rising Star for WatersTechnology's Women in Technology and Data Awards in 2018. Sarah formerly worked at FactSet, where she headed FactSet's machine learning and language technology team. She also worked as an Information Technology Analyst at Lehman Brothers. And Sarah holds a Master's of Science from Columbia University in Computer Science with a focus on natural language processing. She holds a business, is that a bachelor? Sorry, a BBA?
Yeah, it's a bachelor's in business.
Thank you, Sarah.
An MBA, but for a bachelor's.
Gotcha. She holds a bachelor's in business from Baruch College in Computer Information Systems. So with that being said, thank you so much, Sarah, and I'll pass the mic to you.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for having me here, David. And you mentioned my interesting job, so I figured I would start off and talk a little bit about my job, since when I spoke to you, you were pretty interested in it. So I'm part of Fidelity Center for Applied Technology's research team. So Fidelity Center for Applied Technology is our innovation department that's really focused on scanning, trying lots of things with emerging technologies, and then, if successful, scaling it. My role, I'm part of this research team where we really focus, we're taking a bet about what's going on the outside and how to do a rigorous analysis of external trends that we think will really, really matter to our business. And so we focus on looking at emerging technology, cultural trends, things like, people are living longer. How might that impact our business? What are the new expectations for Generation Z, for example? And then we also look at startup trends as well. And based on all these, we make recommendations across our Fidelity so that we can prepare for what we think is coming. The hard part is measuring our team, since we are writing for the future. We basically know if we're right 3 years later. When things we talked about 3 to 5 years earlier make headlines today, then we know, oh, we were right. But it's a really exciting, interesting, and it's really good. A lot of people at Fidelity are focused on, what are we doing on the inside? So we do want to have people really focused on outside of Fidelity. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my research related. I'm focusing specifically on AI and data. And so I want to talk about some of the research I've done in this space. I'm going to start off with one of the fascinating stories recently. Many of you probably know who this is. William Shatner, Captain Kirk on Star Trek, when he turned 90, he decided to come up with a way that he could live forever. And so he spent 45 hours recording answers to questions. The idea is pretty soon you can have a hologram in your living room of William Shatner, and you can ask him any questions, and then using AI, he'll be able to right
after he's no longer alive, which is just pretty amazing.
I also wanted to talk about something else I saw a few years ago with AI, not as exciting as living forever, but for those of you like me who can't find Waldo in those Waldo books, somebody developed a robot that could find Waldo for people, trained on lots of images of pictures of Waldo, and these pictures, it can just find Waldo for you. So when I explain artificial intelligence and what I do to my 8-year-old twins, I explain it by showing them how they're out of a job now. They don't need to find Waldo anymore. And so I always tell people the question I get the most when I talk about it, AI is, will I lose my job? And so the answer, if you're an 8-year-old, is yes. But all jokes aside, obviously everybody here knows that AI is everywhere. We use it every day when we search Google. We use it when we catch a ride with an Uber. We use it when we're looking for movie recommendations from Netflix and what to buy on Amazon. And it's really changed our life in so many ways. There are so many benefits to this technology, but it's really the data that's behind it that is the most important. And because of the data and the AI technology, we are having so much more efficiency in our own personal lives as well as in companies. So many things that used to be manual don't need to be manual anymore. We are using AI and machine learning and lots of technology to help us be informed what's going on across the world from a personal standpoint with our friends, as well as globally in general with news. Our lives have become so much simpler now. Think about pre-Waze and trying to go somewhere with random paper maps and getting lost, and even just the ability to catch a car and a ride whenever you need it. Our lives have become so much simpler because of technology and AI. There are tons of apps using AI to monitor our health, tons of ways we can improve our health with AI as well. And I did want to leave off this section with talking about accessibility, because we talked earlier about jobs. And one of my favorite examples, this was a few years ago, Jamie Dupree was a radio host, and he lost his voice due to a medical illness. So you would think he'd be out of a job completely at that point, but he realized with AI technology, there was possibly a way he could stay in his job. And so a tech company, obviously he's a radio host, his voice is all over. They recreated his voice using AI, and he was able to go back on the air in his own voice. It wasn't perfect, but this technology is getting better and better. And it shows the promise of, as this technology gets so much better, we worry about losing jobs, but this is somebody and a situation where somebody could lose their job, and now because of AI could keep their job. And especially as this technology gets better and better, think of the more ways as people, whether it's due to illness or due to a disability, we can have more jobs because of this technology. So with all these benefits, obviously, pretty much every company today is recognizing that they need to build a data-driven enterprise. I don't know if anybody here knows how many companies are actually successful building this data-driven enterprise. The short answer is it's not 99%. And it's actually 24% of companies that claim that they've successfully built data-driven enterprises. Might even be lower, but these are the companies that claim they've done it. So why is it so hard? And so I spent some time researching what makes a company successful at building a data-driven enterprise. And I found 6 components that are really needed to do this right. The first is democratizing AI. There is not enough AI talent to really be able to do everything you want to do within your organization. And so it's figuring out how to have the right tools to enable more people beyond the data scientists and the smart machine learning PhDs to be able to work with AI. And some of this is tools that help engineers do AI. Some of it is even people without any coding ability having the right tools in place to help them also create AI models and work with AI systems. Also democratizing data. So one of the biggest pain points for data scientists, and I'm sure there's some data scientists here who could vouch for this, is not having the data you need. It's really hard to be a data scientist and not have data, but this is a huge problem. And so companies that are data-driven enterprises are recognizing this and making it easy for the data scientists and the other people who need the data to access that data as and know what data there is. Obviously within limitations surrounding privacy. The third element is transparency. And this is we talked about being transparent in the data, and also about being transparent in the AI models. How do these models work? What's going on behind the scenes? This is incredibly important today. Fourth component is looking at alternative data sources. So it's not enough to just use the obvious data that you have. If you want to really have a good successful model, often, depending on what you're trying to do, you need to look at other types of data that may not be as easy to get, may not be as intuitive, but you might be able to gain some insights from that. And fifth, we talked about the challenges with having enough machine learning talent. And so companies are trying to come up with novel ways of recruiting people with the AI talent. And some companies now are saying, I don't even care about your resume. I'm going to give you data. I'll have a hackathon or just send you data and see what you can do with this data. Forget whatever your background is, because we just need talent, people that can do what we need with this data. And then the last thing is the organizational structure of companies that are successful at making these making themselves data-driven is really different than our historical companies. And unfortunately, there's no one right structure for every company. It really depends on the size of the company. It also depends on where the company is in their data and AI journey. If somebody's starting out in data, they're going to have a different structure than somebody who's been doing it for a very long time. But it's really making sure that data is front and center and has the importance it needs within the organization. So I think in the last few years, one of the things, though, anybody talking about AI and working in AI realized is that we can't just use it blindly. We do need to use it very, very cautiously. And I'm going to highlight a few situations that happened recently. I talked earlier about my favorite example when the radio host went back on the air, but that exact same technology caused a huge issue and is going to continue causing big issues. A criminal said, think about any CEO from a public company, how much their voice is all over the internet. It's everywhere. You can get it from earning calls. It's so easy to just take that CEO's voice, use AI to generate that voice, and then call their report and say, hey, I need some money. And that's what happened. And it's really tough for somebody to know I'm not really speaking to the CEO of my company, even though this person sounds exactly like the CEO. And so this is one of the many problems that we have now with AI, is the same technology that does such amazing things can also be used in a fraudulent way. Another example of there's also many examples that we've seen recently of bias within AI systems. One example, a couple of years ago, Amazon had to get rid of a recruiting tool that ended up being biased against women. And they purposely did not give it information about the gender. This was they didn't know this is a woman's resume, this is a man's resume. But the AI system learned it. It figured it out on its own. Most of the successful resumes, most of the resumes Amazon received were men's resumes. So it learned that certain verbs like execute that are often used in male resumes upgraded that resume. If you mentioned you're president of a women's chess club, your resume got downgraded. The word women's didn't tend to lead to offers. If you mentioned certain women-only universities that you went to, the resume got downgraded. And so it basically had the same bias that humans have. And it was one of the many eye-opening moments for the AI community that we do need. That just because it's AI, just because it's a machine, doesn't mean it's not going to have the same biases that humans have. It's trained on human data. I wanted to also talk about a recent example with, I think, something that's on many of our minds, coronavirus vaccine. When Stanford Medicine got their first doses of the vaccines, they obviously wanted to prioritize to give it to the doctors who came in contact daily or the most with the COVID-19 patients. They thought they created an algorithm that would do that, but that's not at all what happened. They ended up, the medical residents were the doctors that came into contact the most often with the COVID patients, and almost all of them did not get the vaccine. And they were really upset. They had no idea why, because the system was a black box. So later, Stanford looked into seeing what went so horribly wrong here. They created this algorithm thinking they did it all perfectly, and it did the opposite. And so when they looked into it, they realized there were a couple of issues. One was that the algorithm looked at feature of age, and the residents tended to be younger. And it made sense that they asked it to look at age, because we all know that COVID-19 is much more dangerous for people who are older. But there was another issue too. it also looked at where in the hospital, the location of the hospital, because they really wanted to get at the doctors who were coming into contact with the patients with COVID-19. But for the most part, the medical residents didn't have an assigned location in the system. And so therefore, they were almost all overlooked. And this system did the exact opposite of what they wanted it to do. And looking at it now, I know this example has nothing to do with the finance industry, but it really is so applicable to every industry, including finance. When we think about AI, often people, and algorithms in general, often people forget to include the domain experts when working on a project. And I wonder, when I saw this example, I was like, maybe if they had included one medical resident, that would have eliminated the problem. That person would have said, hey, I don't have an assigned location. And so it is something we do need to think about. Do we have the right people working on AI as we're working on these systems? So given all of this, where are we headed? So I've been researching also issues related to not only AI bias, but all of these, there's so many examples of just the failures of AI recently. And there's 4 strategies I've seen that that could help a lot with this issue. I mean, the first is really thinking about diversity and figuring out ways to have more diversity within AI projects. If you look at the stats, AI is even lower than many other fields. And we all know in general that diversity is really important. But for AI specifically, it's even more important so that we could not have many of these issues. If you think about facial recognition systems that work really well for white men and less so for everybody else, you wonder if they're, at a minimum, during beta testing, if there was a diverse group of people working on it, would they have figured out this problem? And so it's coming up with new ways to use to get that diverse talent. And I mentioned earlier with recruiting that Amazon example that went really wrong. But one way that I think AI really could help is to use it in the exact opposite way. Don't use it to eliminate resumes, use it to add resumes. As a human, we might look at a resume and say, oh, this person really doesn't have any of the skills I'm looking for, any of the background I'm looking for. This person's resume looks totally different. But an AI system might look at it and say, what do you mean? This person has all the skills. They just took a completely different path to get there. And so using AI as a way to include something that a human, because we all have biases, might have overlooked, is a good way in general to bring in more diverse candidates, not only in AI, but really everywhere as well, in other fields too. There's plenty of tools out there that can help you open up the black box of machine learning and deep learning, tools that help you explain what's going on, tools that can help test if there's any bias in your system. And many of them are open source. A lot of companies are also developing them. And so this is pretty much a must as you're working with AI today. The third area, I've seen some companies are starting to create ethics boards, hiring diverse groups of people to really oversee. And it's not only about AI and AI bias, really any type of issue that could come up from technology. And this group really needs to be diverse. It has to have, and diverse in many ways, people who understand the business, people who can understand the technology, people who are subject matter experts, internal, external perspectives. And also, whenever you're creating any type of board, but especially for AI, it's think about the people who might be harmed, who is not in your data, who is in your data too much. Think about the people who might accidentally be harmed by your system, and those people should definitely be represented well in this board. And lastly, training. So many people, when we think about AI training, we have tons of technical courses, and some universities now are starting to have courses related to ethics, ethical AI, but still many people who went to school a while ago didn't have any ethical training, and even people who had it now, they may have had only one course depending on the university they went to. And so it's really important for organizations to start training in these topics. How can we best label our data so we don't have issues? How can we best measure accuracy across demographics? So many things that we might not have been taught, but are so important as we're working on AI systems. And I wanted to end with also making sure we think about AI right in terms of the human and the machine. There's so many people trying to do everything with AI, even things that humans are better at, which doesn't really make sense. Let's leave the human stuff for the humans. And the same is also true. There's some things the machines are better at. Don't have a human do that. And so, one example is thinking about doctors. Giving a doctor a tool that's going to help them diagnose patients doesn't take away from what the doctor does. If anything, it helps them help their patients a lot more by having the appropriate, having a better diagnosis. They can give better treatment. Another example, a factory worker. If you give them robots to do heavy lifting, then at some point, if they lost their strength as they aged or anything happened, they can still stay in their job, do the customizable work that needs to be done by that by them, and leave the heavy lifting for the robot. And so it's really thinking about making sure to use the strengths of both humans and machines so that we can really excel as much as possible when it comes to really every industry. There are, plenty of now, anyone with children probably has started seeing toys that are teaching kids. A lot of them are starting to use AI to educate. There are elderly facilities that are using AI to entertain the elderly. And so we are seeing across lifespans that it's going to continue, that AI is just becoming a given across our lifespan in every situation. And so as much as there are plenty of issues, we do need to think about the best way to do AI and gain the benefits, as well as be careful and about mitigating some of these risks, because AI is here and we should look at how to continue using it in the best way possible as we build that data-driven enterprise. And we should have time now for questions. I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. It was a nice overview, and I really appreciate the depth that you did go into on some of those points. It was really nice. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to put those into the chat. One of the things we'll just let some people formulate some questions as we continue. I have a couple for myself. Sarah, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is forming an ethics board. It's not something that comes to mind immediately when you think of, or when people mention some of the steps that they can take to make sure that they're being responsible in the use of their data. What might that look like if we're looking into details? I mean, you have companies of different sizes, ranging from startups to mid-sized companies to large enterprises. Does it change? I mean, it's obviously going to change a little bit, right? Based on the company and the budget size and the amount of people that you have. Do you have any insights into how one might go about looking to form an data ethics board within their organization?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely going to be different for a large company and a smaller company. So just because the amount of products that you offer and the amount of potentially even industries that you're in is so varied. So if you want people that are really subject matter experts and you're a large organization, you might need a lot more people who could be subject matter experts on different parts of your technologies that you're building or whatever it is, experiences you're offering. And a smaller, very new startup who might only be doing one thing right now doesn't need to worry as much about making sure they have subject matter experts in 20 different things if they're only doing one thing. So it's definitely, I think in a way, it's probably easier to start when you're small because you could probably not have to worry as much about so much expertise. The other thing that some companies are doing is having multiple ethics boards for different parts of their business. As they're very large, it might be too hard to find, or maybe in some cases you could also have an overall ethics board, but often this way you can also specialize within certain parts of your organization by having, if it's really a massive organization, by having smaller groups that, for each part, different parts of the business.
And with these, I'm assuming that they would typically sign an NDA. I mean,
so some companies are doing, I think it depends if you're going externally or internally.
Yeah.
That some companies are doing it internally, some are doing it externally. If it's externally, I'm assuming they would probably want an NDA or definitely want one. But many companies are doing internal ethics boards, and then they don't need to worry about that aspect.
Thank you, Sarah. That's interesting. Having followed the trends, or what seems to be the anecdotal trends, throughout the last 4 or 5 years, I know initially companies were sort of broadcasting all the amazing things that they're doing with AI, while still trying to stockpile data scientists and sort of fight to hold talent and find talent. Recently, this past year, 2 years, we've really seen companies try and press on, especially with the financial situation that we found ourselves in COVID, press on results and, what type of return are we getting from our investment. In some large organizations, and this has always been a struggle, you get folks on the board, for example, that maybe don't necessarily understand the depth and the requirement and the investment and the time and the resources that go into successfully deploying AI in production level environments. So you might get some silly things, and I've heard multiple data teams complain about this, where it's, oh, we need to show results by the end of the quarter to justify the expenditures, et cetera, et cetera. If you're working on a team and you want to make sure that you're taking the appropriate steps to make sure the ethics and the explainability and the attention to detail to make sure that you're not sort of promulgating these biases in your data, and you're looking at this and you're thinking, wow, it's going to be tough because we just got funding, say, for a data science team, or we just got funding for a project, and now I have to go back and explain why all these careful steps have to be taken into consideration, and maybe the funding gets cut, or maybe there's all these other issues. It can be looked on as a competitive disadvantage. But do you find that some companies, or maybe the most successful companies, might look at this as, hey, in the near or the short term, this might be an inconvenience, it might be time or money spent, but in the long term, this could actually be a competitive advantage for us, because we're going to be taking a lot of steps back if we get into regulatory trouble or something more severe. What's your intuition? Do companies look at this at the moment as a competitive advantage, or is it still really pulling teeth trying to get companies to take these steps?
So at the moment, I would say companies are not looking at it as a competitive advantage. At the moment, it's still struggle to figure out, what is that right time, and how do we not take too long. One example is it was Amazon, who had a celebrity facial recognition system tool, and then Google created a similar one. I might be mixing the companies up, but it took, I think Google noticed that it didn't work for Black celebrities, and so they spent another year plus trying to get it to work for everybody. And basically Amazon's product was out 2 years earlier because of this. And so that's definitely something that is a huge problem. Is you could spend a lot more time on doing something to get it done right. And what does that mean for your business if your competitor has it out years before you? So this is an issue, I would say, that's an ongoing issue that people haven't really figured out. And one thing that makes me optimistic is the fact that there are so many tools today start making AI easier and easier to develop. So, just a couple of years ago, trying to do everything from the data cleaning to productionalizing machine learning, every step was so slow that I'm hoping people will take the time now that there's so many tools that we could use to productionalize machine learning, to take some of that time that maybe we gained and use that to focus on the ethical side of things, and spend time checking if your model is fair. But it's still an open question on how much is too much. When can you decide that your system is good enough? There's so many kinds of bias. There's so many potential issues, so I think as of now, I agree with you that I think it could be a very big competitive advantage, but it could take a long time to do AI correctly, and it is something that people haven't figured out how to do it in the right pace yet.
Yeah, and that's these conversations are really important because it is so new. A lot of organizations, you don't really know what they are doing, but they're really just doing a form of advanced analytics. Very few companies have deep neural nets in production level environments. So it's so new. We do have a couple questions coming in. So Rizwan asks, did you face any challenges to educate the IT to deploy these AI apps? If so, can you share a few? So I think Rizwan's asking, so what are some of the challenges to educating the IT teams in deploying some of these different apps or different AI applications?
So in my current role, I'm not focused on the production side of things because I'm more focused on the future and where things are headed and helping the company prepare for what is coming over the next 5 years. In my past role, I was heading up a machine learning team at a different company. And there, we definitely had challenges of educating. It was also, I've been at Fidelity for 3 years, so this goes back a few years when people were still a little more confused about AI. I think things are easier now to some degree, that more people are much more understanding about AI and the benefits of AI. But it definitely, there are still challenges across the board. It's just doing something a different way. Is it really, is it necessary? Is it helpful? Trying to make changes in general can be a struggle in the beginning. Also, people feel very threatened by AI. Is my job going to go away now that you're doing something completely different? So there are plenty of challenges in my role right now. I don't focus on them. I guess I have the good job where I don't have to focus on the production challenges. I get to just explore the future. But definitely anybody who's working on the production side of things in AI, especially a few years ago, at least the good news is I think it's a little easier now since people are much more aware of the benefits of AI.
Amira, I was wondering if you could share your comment on the trends of AI in capital markets such as algorithmic trading, or if you're aware of any other trends in this domain.
So there's definitely a lot of ways people are using AI in this industry, for sure. When it comes to trying to generate alpha, many companies are exploring alternative data sets and other ways to try to enhance what they have to help customers more. And there are also plenty of ways people are using AI. I would say the most common way that many companies start with AI is also operations behind the scenes, systems that might have been very manual, figuring out ways to automate them. So much unstructured data, tons of NLP, figuring out how to automate and automatically structure some of that unstructured data so that we could gain insights from that data. Figuring out, which products do you recommend to which customers is definitely a financial services problem, as well as pretty much every industry. You don't want to bombard your customers about, hey, there's a new enhancement to every product. And AI is being used very commonly. Also, when it comes to risks, many kinds of risks, are the employees doing what they're supposed to with data and with all sorts of things? People are using AI for that, with risks surrounding even, is this a good company to invest in? AI can see so much more data that it could might be able to say, hey, there's this issue you may not have noticed. And so those are just some of the ways. And then there's also the chatbots, which obviously have been gaining popularity over the last few years, robo-advisors being used to enhance some advising. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great, Sarah. Thank you. It's a good overview. And Amira as well, I would recommend Dagash, who's going to speak on the last session of the day from the Vanguard Group. He's very much involved in the technical nitty-gritty, and I'd be very curious to hear how he responds to that question. So if you're around for that session, Dagash, I would recommend speaking with him and probably connecting with him offline as well. That's great. So we have time for one last question from Suhrit. I guess this is a generic question, but the whole concept of AI is essentially training a machine by feeding it tons of data for it to quote unquote learn. My question is, how do you train it for scenarios that might or may happen in the future? That's a fun question. That's good.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a good one to end with. Whenever I look back at 2020, it's my example of when AI just doesn't work. And you think about the pandemic and when it hit, AI couldn't figure out we would all start to garden and bake bread. And all of the AI systems, everybody trying to buy hand sanitizer and even toilet paper, and we couldn't buy it at all. And I think it was an eye-opening moment that AI only works with historical data, and we don't live in a static world. We live in a changing world, and AI just doesn't work when the world changes. One example also in our industry is companies that were looking at sentiment of Twitter to try to figure out investment strategies. And if you looked at Twitter when the pandemic hit, it was all like doom and gloom in general. And that really affected the sentiment models. And so I think that's just, I mean, there's so many examples. Fraud is another example. Companies, all of a sudden, we're all buying gardening equipment, and people were getting calls from their credit card companies. This looks like a fraudulent purchase. You've never gardened in your life. And so to me, I would say what this is, I think, showed at least, is that really we can't do everything with pure machines. We need humans looking at it, because if we have humans, we can quickly fix these models to say, okay, sentiment is always going to be a little bit worse in general. Let's change things around here now. And so I think that it's really hard, probably impossible, to have a perfect AI model in a changing world when something changes drastically. So we do need to make sure we have somewhat of a human in the loop system that we can quickly go and fix something like this when a pandemic breaks out and all of a sudden all our models fail.
Yeah, and that's hopefully we don't have to go through it.
Hopefully the pandemic doesn't happen again, but we probably will have some changes in our world because the world is not static, but hopefully it's not another pandemic.
Absolutely. Sarah, thank you so much. I see that your email is here for those who want to keep in touch, maybe have some follow-up questions or something to share with Sarah. I really appreciate you making yourself available, Sarah, and taking the time to deliver this great talk. And thank you so much. I hope we have you back again.
No problem. Happy to. And you can email me find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I can answer any other questions. Thank you for having me here, David.
You're most welcome. And for those, we're just up to 11:35 Eastern Standard Time. So we're just kicking off the other sessions in the other room. So I'll let everybody get back to those. And thank you so much. Enjoy.
No problem. You too.